Part one was about ancient Southeast Asia. Where were the roots? So keywords like Austronesian migration, keywords like places like the Nia caves, the Banqiang villages, as well as the Dongson villages. These are all places where cultures first began. And then about 2000 years ago, these maritime kingdoms began, these villages and towns began to develop into more powerful kingdoms. And how did this come about? And what religious practices did they have? And what were the kind of trade items that they actually traded in? So the fourth place that I asked you to identify was this place that was called Rome, the Roman Forum in Rome. In the West, the Roman Empire became strong and powerful, and they had a high demand for goods that were in China, goods like silk especially, right? At the same time, this was not in your slide, this is not in one of the places that you had. You had powerful kingdoms that developed in southern part of India as well, the Chola Empire. And you had in the Central Asian area near Afghanistan, you had powerful kingdoms and empires that were being created. And they're growing wealthy and rich from this demand in trade. In the Tang Empire, Tang Dynasty, there was in Xian, you also had a powerful empire that was growing, and this was called the Tang Dynasty, right? And the main religion at this time was actually Buddhism. So this is the place that you identified as your fifth location, and this is called the Taming Palace. It's a recreation of what the palace was like, because the palace had burned down I think in 900 plus AD, and this is a recreation of it. But nonetheless, the reason why I showed you Rome and the reason why I showed you the Tang Dynasty was because I wanted you to understand that the trade routes didn't just go by overland through the deserts of Central Asia, but it also came by sea. And it was not just goods that traveled there, and were not just traders that actually used these trade routes. Pilgrims as well as monks also traveled from east to west. Monks from China went to India because they wanted to learn the Buddhist scriptures. So people like Xian traveled to Java and India to copy down and to learn the Sanskrit Buddhist scripts. People like I Ching went to Srivijaya as well by sea. And they stopped in different places where there were monasteries, and they lived there, and they learned Buddhism, and they learned Sanskrit language before they went to India to actually learn about Buddhism. So these were the trade routes that you saw, right, that I came across. The red one is an overland route. The blue one that you see is called a maritime route. That means going by sea. So what goods did they peddle in? What did they trade in? In the Roman Empire, there was a high demand for silk. So that emperor that you see there is wearing a silk, kind of like a cloak that he has. And you can only get silk from China. There was a high demand for spices that gave you all kinds of different kinds of foods. In China, they would actually want the gold and the silver from the Roman Empire, as well as Roman glass. So this demand and supply for goods led to the development of the first Southeast Asian kingdoms. For those of you who have gone to the Asian Civilization Museum, there's a shipwreck that you see, that you can find, where actually there's shipwreck items that they were able to actually excavate from underwater. And these were the items that are found there. A gold plate with a swastika sign on it. So gold was actually traded on board these ships. You had 50,000 of these bowls, changsha bowls, that was found on board the ship. 50,000, not 1,000, no, 50,000, and all with different designs. Sometimes with even Islamic designs, as well as birds and flowers and things like that. And if you have been to the Maritime Experiential Museum in Sentosa, you'll come across that there's this big boat that they have. And this is a model of that ship that was sunk off the Belitung Islands in the Java Seas, right? It's an Arabian dhow, actually. So this was how lucrative and how profitable the trade was. Eventually, the sixth place that you identified was the rise of these ancient kingdoms that you come across. And this place was called Okio. And all those places that you see that are red on the dots on the map that you see on your right will show you where all these ports are, right? They were Hindu in origin. They were at first Hindu, and then later on they also absorbed certain Buddhist practices. And this was the first maritime civilization that became rich and powerful. There's a mistake there. So it's Funan Kingdom. It's not Palembang, but actually it is Vietnam and Cambodia. The seventh place, maybe 600 years after the Funan Empire came about, was this place that is called the Srivijaya Empire, right? So the place that you were supposed to locate was this place that's called Bukit Seguntang, in Palembang in Sumatra. And there's a river that you see. If you look at the Google Earth map, there's a river that you see there, right? And that river was responsible for actually the trade routes that went to the seas in the area, the Straits of Malacca and as part of Sumatra. The people who were responsible for the rise of Srivijaya were, of course, the rulers of Srivijaya, who were land-based, the people who lived in the highlands, who could actually hunt for, who could actually bring down minerals and tin and gold and various other precious metals, as well as these people who actually live by the sea, right? They are called the Orang Laut. And if you look at the Malay annals or the Sejarah Melayu, the chronicles of the Malay, it will tell you that the founder of these people was Sri Tribuana or Sang Nila Utama. And he has got actually origins that are divine. He's half divine and half man. And he traces his roots back to actually Alexander the Great, such that eventually when he was born, he was born in Palembang, the fields of Palembang began to actually turn to gold. And a local chief, or maybe he's a leader of the Orang Laut, whose name was called Damang Laba Daun, or the chief broadleaf, swore that he will forever be loyal to him. And in return, he would not shame his people. So this story, the Sejarah Melayu, tells you about how the Srivijaya Empire came about and the origins of the Srivijayan Empire. Okay, so the Orang Laut were expert seamen, and they traded in meat and shells from the sea turtle, oysters, pearls, edible seaweed. They were expert fishermen. They traded in sea cucumbers. They sold all kinds of fish. And they also traded in a special kind of wood that I think many of you have learned in your history, and that's called laka wood. It's a kind of incense that you have, and when you burn it, there's a very strong fragrance. And they believe that this is welcoming to the Buddhist gods and the Hindu gods. So these items were in high demand, right? So this is about the Srivijaya. So I mentioned Funan, Okio, as well as I mentioned Palembang, Srivijaya. Okay. Eventually, there were intermarriages that took place, and this is the 8th place that I mentioned. So in this place, you will find that the royal members, the royal court of Srivijaya sometimes intermarried with local rulers as well, who were actually very powerful as well. And so there was this dynasty in Java that called themselves the Sailendra family, or the Sailendra dynasty. And they intermarried with these people, and these people were the ones who created one of the most beautiful places in Southeast Asia, and there's the Borobudur temple complex. This is Buddhist in nature, right? And so this explains and shows you how wide Southeast Asia is, right? The trade routes that actually exist. Eventually, in that place that you see that circled there were other kinds of goods that were now in high demand. And these were things like spices that you come across, the sea anise and nutmegs, as well as all different kinds of spices that you could see. And birds of paradise. So this is actually someone who's wearing a hat. So if you look at the Hindu princes and maybe eventually the British rulers, they actually like to wear hats that have a lot of feathers in it, peacock feathers and things like that. And the Orang Laut were also people who actually got this and actually traded in these items as well. Of course, there were other things like earthenware as well as Chinese porcelain that eventually and tin that were used as currency that began to come in. They were also in high demand. The ninth place that we mentioned is Nagapattinam, right? So the reason why I placed this on your map, and this will be the last place that I'll mention, is because Nagapattinam is a place where there was a powerful kingdom that was called the Chola Empire. And led by their ruler, Rajendra Chola, they eventually launched a series of raids and attacks on Srivijayan ports. They eventually also captured the Srivijayan ruler, brought him to Nagapattinam, or I think someplace in Tamil Nadu, and they had him executed. And as a result, the Srivijayan Empire, over a period of maybe 20 to 50 years, began to decline. Many of the kingdoms that were once vassal states or once paid homage to Srivijaya began to break away and set up their own ports. And one of those ports is the kingdom of Singapura.